today. And I just have to hit yes on the recording. So thank you. Thank you, first of all, for having me. And thank you for all the work that you do with the Institute and with HM Classics Academy. I know many of us here have enjoyed your classes at both through both mediums. So it's a great pleasure to be able to study under you and now to present with you. So let me see if I can share my screen here, and then we'll have the PowerPoint up, and hopefully this will go smoothly here. Yeah, so I'm presenting on the philosopher's hero, and specifically on the last days of Socrates, his trial and death, mostly focusing on the Phaedo, which really is a beautiful portrait of Socrates' swan song, or his final thoughts, his final things to share with us. So I want to begin by looking at this passage from the Republic, because Plato's Republic begins with the word katebein, and Socrates starts that dialogue with describing his going down, or his katebein, his katabasis, going down to Piraeus. And the choice of katebein has sparked association with various literary katabasis, most notably Odysseus's, and has offered insight into viewing the dialogue on the whole as a descent into another world. The Phaedo, however, bound necessarily as a dialogue in the physical world, stops short of describing Socrates' literal katabasis post-Hemlock, though Socrates himself enjoys fantasizing on the theme. The dialogue is presented to benefit Socrates' friends who will mourn his loss or fear for his annihilation after death. As such, the dialogue, while focusing on the poignant details of Socrates' heroic death, has an emphasis on its own reception by Socrates' interlocutors and by the dialogue's present readers, all of us. The Phaedo begins not with a descent, as in the Republic. Plato leaves that glory for the hero, Socrates alone. Let me see if I can get this thing. But the Phaedo, let's see if I can get this. The Phaedo begins with one's self, or autos. And here we have the first lines of autos ho phaedon. Were you there with Socrates, yourself, Phaedo, on the actual day that he drank the poison in the prison? So a bit of a different focus here as he begins the work. So the opening lines of the Phaedo situate Phaedo, the character, the interlocutor, as an immediately present participant in the events that he is about to recollect. Ironically, however, Plato himself is notably absent on account of illness. And in a superb feat of metadialectics, Plato has Phaedo recall a dialogue in the past, a dialogue the author himself did not participate in, and one in which Socrates himself recalls both past events and his own pet arguments, most notably the theory of recollection itself. But as we shall see, Socrates participates in a recollection not merely of his own previous lives, but of the lives of the heroes and oral poets before him, as you can see here. And most notably those heroes being Heracles, Achilles, and Odysseus. So the choice of a dialogue itself may be interpreted as a nod to oral poetry of the Homeric epics. And in this way, Socrates is engaging with, and at times reinterpreting, what has come before him in the great conversation. That Socrates is portrayed as a hero need hardly be emphasized. And if the philosopher king is to be desired in the Republic, in the Phaedo, it is the philosopher hero who is immortalized. And as will be seen, the Homeric heroes are never far from the philosopher's mind, though often adjusted or reimagined to suit the nature of the present discussion. And it is through strategic association with Homeric heroes that Plato's Socrates is able to frame himself as the ultimate philosopher hero. And while a philosopher king may live, a philosopher hero must die. Like Achilles and Heracles, Socrates will achieve lasting kleos through death, and like Odysseus, with whom he is most associated in the Phaedo, Socrates' soul will attain nostos when separated from the body in immortality. Situating the Phaedo in its Homeric context will also demonstrate that Socrates' protean concept of the soul finds its basis in Homeric psyche. And just to back up the point, I wanted to share this quote from Longinus's On the Sublime, because here he references all the people that have channeled Homer in the past, and he says, above all others, Plato, who drew off for his own use 10,000 runnels from the great Homeric spring. So it is not merely a modern thought that Socrates is channeling Homer. It's obviously something that antiquity enjoyed and understood as well. Now, oops, not yet. Socrates himself is a work of reception, that is, leaving us no writings of his own. We are the prisoners of his followers' imaginations of him. And the same may be said of Homer, for no original copy of the first Musaic supplication to sing the wrath of Achilles can ever be possessed. We are left with the versions that have been recorded, altered, tampered, and misinterpreted through the ages. And this concept, in part, has been suggested as to why Socrates himself left nothing for posterity. Socrates expresses his personal dissatisfaction with writing in the Phaedrus. Writing to Socrates forfeits not only a good memory, but also preserves arguments which, without the presence of its author, cannot explain further questions or which might be misconstrued. However, Heilman, in his article Why Plato Wrote Dialogues, explains how the dialogues as a genre are able to circumvent this issue, because they are imitations. These dialogues that are about Socrates are imitations of philosophic situations, of what it would be like to philosophize. Indeed, those dialogues, which are secondhand accounts like Parmenides' Symposium, the Theaetetus, they are, as imitations of what went on at a meeting, imitations of imitations, or art in precisely the way that it is characterized in the Republic. The point is, as imitations of philosophy, they are not philosophy, the reality itself. That is why Plato can say truthfully that he has never written his philosophy. But like the best works of art, these imitations may lead the beholder to reality itself. The philosophers, thus, as we saw earlier, the image of philosophy which is presented in the dialogues may lead us to be philosophers ourselves. Thus, and as we saw earlier, the dialogues function both as imitations of and as invitations to philosophy. So the nature of the dialogue then functions to encourage its readers or listeners in their own philosophic questions. The journey to become philosopher is aided, not impeded by the dialogue, a dialogue in which the present interlocutor is encouraged to participate himself. Sidestepping the mandate against writing philosophy, Plato instead invites us to participate in Phaedo's recollection of a past recollection of Socrates' recollections, which in turn may force us to recollect certain truths or falsehoods over the course of the dialogue. The philosopher's muse, like Hesiod's, is not constrained to speak the truth uniquely. That burden falls to the responder. But that the questions posed should propagate further questions would seem to be the telos of the work. So in Oral Philosopher Poet, Socrates creates the greatest music of all, philosophy, and this we find has been a divine command. So looking at this passage from the Phaedo, we find very early on that he tells his interlocutors on his last day that in the course of my life, I have often had intimations in dreams that I should make music. And this word in Greek is musike, which often gets translated as arts because it represents something that's much larger than simply music itself. But I wanted to choose a translation that does represent, he is talking about music that can include poetry, that can include verse, as we find him writing a hymn to Apollo and versifying the fables of Aesop at this moment. But he is connecting himself in a way to the songs that we hear from Homer and from earlier oral poets. So throughout his life, he's had intimations that he should make music. He said, the same dream came to me, sometimes in one form and sometimes in another, but always saying the same or nearly the same words. Make and cultivate music, said the dream. And hitherto I had imagined that this was only intended to exhort and encourage me in the study of philosophy, which has always been the pursuit of my life and is the best and noblest of music. So Socrates is himself identifying what he is doing, philosophy itself, the dialogue as a whole, as something musical. Now, ironically, this is Socrates' response to why he has been writing poetry, which we wouldn't necessarily think of as music in the modern sense, but it is in this Greek sense. In the interval before his death, he has pondered whether the command was to write literal poetry music, and thus he has composed a hymn to Apollo and committed some of Aesop's fables to verse, as I just mentioned. So perhaps Socrates' argument, which is one of the arguments he brings up during the course of the dialogue, his argument against suicide, why one philosopher should accept death but not hasten it on his own. His argument against suicide could be connected here, because as one should not commit suicide because one is the god's personal property, this may extend to this sort of prevention of literary suicide for Socrates. For Socrates, per the Phaedo, did write, albeit not philosophy, and it's not truly preserved. We just get the mention of it here in the Phaedo, in the dialogue, and it's left to Plato, the absent philosopher, or the philosopher who is absent in this dialogue, to continue it for us. Now, looking at his trial, which occurs during the Apology, we see that he is going to say, in the Phaedo, first of all, I am afraid that other people do not realize that the one aim of those who practice philosophy in the proper manner is to practice for dying and death. And we'll find that he alludes to this idea in the Apology as well. So according to Gregory Nagy, the ancient Greek hero scripts his own death, and that script becomes a vital point of passage for the hero, as his kleos, or his fame through song, is never greater than at the moment of death. This is true of the Phaedo, the most poignant of Platonic dialogues, in which Socrates not only dies himself, but also describes the whole philosophical life as the preparation for death. And if his arguments are deemed successful, he prepares his companions for his death and for their own eventual deaths as well. Socrates goes as far as to choose death twice. When sentenced in the Apology, he shuns exile, arguing publicly and privately against it, in the Apology and in the Crito, respectively, as in the Crito is a dialogue where he rejects exile when a friend offers to help him escape. So his choice to die, besides aligning with Socrates' notion of justice to the city's laws, may be connected to Achilles, who in Book 9 of the Iliad, the embassy to Achilles, tells his interlocutors that he is faced with two fates: to continue the war and have an early death, thus losing his nostos but gaining eternal kleos, or to return, have his nostos, have a longer life, but forfeit his kleos. And both Achilles and Socrates ultimately choose to die, and both achieve lasting kleos. So Achilles, in scripting his future death, couches it in terms of Heracles, which is something that we'll find Socrates doing as well. So here's the passage from Iliad 18, where Achilles is accepting the fact that he is going to re-enter the battle and by doing so die. And he says, not even the mighty Heracles could escape the death specter, he who was beloved above all by Zeus, the son of Cronos, but his due destiny and Hera's cruel anger beat him down. And I too, if indeed a destiny like this has been shaped for me, will one day lie in death. Now, the one common trait amongst these heroes is their mortality. Now, whether they're descended from a god like Heracles or Achilles, or if they possess the voice of a god like Socrates is said to in his prophetic role, their fate is still to die. So like Achilles in his defense, Socrates compares his labors to Heracles, the hero who became the model for all future heroes. And he felt compelled to test the Delphic oracle, which proclaimed him the wisest of men, and the testing and making enemies of men from all ranks became his Heraclean labor. His fearless choice to make enemies, which led to eventual prosecution and execution, mirrors Achilles' choice to re-enter the battle after the death of Patroclus, and Socrates himself is going to make this comparison. So here he is in the Apology, explaining why he made his decision to pursue and test the oracle, and by doing so, making why he wasn't afraid of death if it came to that. So perhaps someone might say, are you not ashamed, Socrates, that you have pursued such activities as a result of which you risk being put to death? To this, I would offer the just response that you are wrong, my friend, if you think a man who has even a little bit of worth in him has to take the risk of life or death into account. Rather than considering this only when he does something, whether he is acting rightly or wrongly, and whether it's the action of a good or bad man. You see by your arguments, those demigods who died at Troy would be worthless, all of them, including the son of Thetis, who so scorned danger rather than endure some disgrace, that when in his eagerness to kill Hector, his mother, who was a goddess, said to him something like this: I think, my son, if you are going to avenge the death of your companion Patroclus and kill Hector, you will die yourself. For immediately, I tell you, she says, after Hector, doom awaits. On hearing this, he thought little of death and danger, but being much more afraid of living the life of an evil man and not avenging his friends, said, may I die right now when I have made the unjust man pay the penalty, in order not to remain here a laughingstock beside the crooked-beaked ships, a burden on the earth. You don't think that he had any thought for death and danger, do you? So Socrates is envisioning himself as an Achillean hero, or as Montilio states, the philosopher sets himself up as an Achilles type. While it is customary to think of military leaders, most notably Alexander the Great, forging their fame through comparison with Achilles, the philosopher hero, Socrates, though far from achieving military prowess, must master himself in Achillean fashion. As Holway explains, Socrates' shift from lashing out at his accusers to self-condemnation and self-ordained death also follows an Achillean precedent. And Holway devotes a lengthy passage to this, lengthy discussion of this passage, while admitting that Socrates and his vocation are so antithetical to Achilles and his, that the comparison seems freighted with irony. And truly, there are many obvious differences between the two. Achilles fought Trojans, and Socrates fights shadows, as he expresses it in the Apology, that he is fighting the shadows of his accusers, not literal men. Achilles dies in the prime of youth, and Socrates when he's over 70. Achilles fights with weapons, and Socrates fights with his words, or his logoi. Achilles channels Menis, the divine wrath or rage of the gods, and Socrates metis, his mental skill. But there is more to Socrates' self-comparison, for while Socrates may be advanced in age, he does, in a sense, die in his prime. Socrates, who cares little to nothing for the body, would not be dying at his zenith if he were at the height of bodily health. Rather, Socrates, for whom reason can help man separate the concepts of body and soul, dies when he is at the peak of his own philosophy, having completed his Heraclean labors, and thereby, in a sense, confirming the oracle that he is the wisest. And as another wise man in Herodotus, Solon, explains to Croesus, it is deemed best to die after a great achievement. And as Socrates elucidates in the Phaedo, the philosopher cultivates this kind of practice for death, such as he has now successfully scripted for himself. Now, we've seen Socrates compare himself to Achilles in the Apology, and now throughout the Odyssey, we'll see a connection between Socrates and Odysseus, or Socrates and the Odyssey itself. Well, the Phaedo will begin with a delay. Socrates cannot die until the ship of Apollo returns from Delos. Odysseus, in his first appearance in his eponymous epic, looks longingly out at sea, wishing for a vehicle to convey him to his homeland. And neither Socrates nor Odysseus can possess the complete nostos before the arrival of a ship for Socrates, or before the arrival or the building of a raft for Odysseus. Now, Socrates' ship is part of a religious festival dedicated to Apollo in honor of Theseus's victory over the Minotaur, and you can see the quotation here. According to the Athenians, it's the ship in which Theseus once sailed to those so-called twice seven band, both saved them and saved himself. Now, at the time, the Athenians vowed to Apollo, so it said that if they were saved, they would send in return a mission to Delos every year, which indeed they've been doing in honor of the gods since that time, annually right up to the present day. So as soon as they've started the mission, the law is they must keep the city pure and not carry out any public executions before the ship has been to Delos and come back again. But sometimes this takes a long time whenever there are contrary winds. The beginning of the mission is when Apollo's priest plays a wreath on the stern of the ship. And this happened by chance, as I say, a day before the trial took place. And that's the reason why Socrates spent such a long time in prison between the trial and his execution. So in the Apology, Socrates is said to have been confirmed wisest man by Apollo's oracle at Delphi, and that Socrates himself possesses an internal oracle. And as Socrates approaches his death, he appears to sort of come into that prophetic power associated with Apollo, such as he describes in the Apology. And he says in the Apology, I would fain prophesy to you, for I am about to die. And that is the hour in which men are gifted with prophetic power, again, associating himself with Apollo. And again, in the Phaedo, he describes the song of swans, which are sacred to Apollo, and particularly appropriate at the close of his festival. So you can see here, he says in the Phaedo on the right, but men, because of their own fear of death, tell lies about the swans and say that they lament their death and sing in sorrow. They do not reflect that no bird sings when it is hungry or cold or suffers in any other way, neither the nightingale nor the swallow nor the hoopoe, though they do say that these sing laments when in pain. Nor do the swans, but I believe that they belong to Apollo. They are prophetic, have knowledge of the future, and sing of the blessings of the underworld, sing and rejoice on that day beyond what they did before. As I believe myself to be a fellow servant with the swans and dedicated to the same God, and have received from my master a gift of prophecy not inferior to theirs, I am no more despondent than they on leaving life. Therefore, you must speak and ask whatever you want, as long as the authorities allow it. And this is how he frames his final conversation. And I did put up just a brief comparison. If you're familiar with the Phaedrus, there's a lot of swan topology there as well, and some references to Apollo, as well as Socrates' argument of the theory of recollection and the pre-incarnate version of the soul versus the soul in the afterlife. So there's some connection with swans and Apollo throughout the Platonic corpus, and he is certainly associating himself with one here. So Socrates specifically identifies himself as a prophet servant of Apollo, and the Phaedo thus becomes his swan song, a further connection to the musical nature of Homeric epic. Apollo's ship was garlanded the day preceding Socrates' trial, and Socrates' death comes the day after its return. In this way, the entirety of Socrates' last days are framed by an Apollonian festival. The Odyssey, too, frames its final books around an Apollonian festival, during which Odysseus performs the contest of the bow, which is Apollo's weapon, which is in turn compared to a lyre, which is Apollo's instrument. And Socrates fulfills a call to create music and composes a hymn to Apollo, and while he never uses a literal bow, the lyre will form part of his argument for the immortality of the soul. Now, in the Apology, Plato's Socrates self-styles himself as a philosopher version of Achilles. And in the Phaedo, Plato styles Socrates as a philosopher Odysseus. That Odysseus is a favorite hero of Socrates, or Plato's Socrates, can hardly be denied, even if one discounts the Lesser Hippias, which is a short dialogue, which some people consider to be possibly not written by Plato, possibly he was, we're not sure. But in that argument, Socrates argues on the side of Odysseus as opposed to Achilles, and he'll argue following him as the greater hero. And there are countless other references to Odysseus throughout the Platonic corpus. So to return to the Republic, which, as we've noted before, begins with a kind of catabasis, or a descent to the underworld, Socrates concludes his discussion in the Republic with a catabasis account in the myth of in which the prominent hero is Odysseus. So here we have This is a quote from Montilio's Plato's Odysseus, A Soldier in the Soul. This is an article or book chapter tracing the reception of Odysseus. And so he says that this narrative, the narrative of the myth of which occurs at the end of the book of Republic, 10th book of Republic, this narrative shows Plato fully aware of the charges leveled against Odysseus in 5th century literature, but warmly sympathetic to him. Himself, an Odysseus figure, a traveler to the underworld and back, alludes to Odysseus's encounter in Hades with the shades of Agamemnon, Achilles, and Ajax. The absence of Achilles from the account might suggest that Odysseus has gained a higher status, that, duly purified of his ambition, he is a more suitable model of heroism. The soul of Odysseus takes care of the purification by choosing the inconspicuous life of a man who does not meddle in politics. And this refers, of course, to in the myth of this young man is not fully dead. Instead, he has come back to life and recounts what he's seen here. And of all the different souls that are choosing their next life down in the underworld, Odysseus bypasses all the ones that were of fame or great importance and chooses just a quiet sort of philosopher style life. And that's something that Montilio argues in his article, his book chapter. So if Plato's Socrates portrays Odysseus as being sort of purified in this myth of or after his sufferings, they have purified him, so too does Plato portray Socrates throughout the entirety of the Phaedo. And Robinson makes this quote talking about how the whole dialogue, the whole Phaedo, abounds in language like purification, religious initiation, purity of the soul, contamination of the body, and the like. It is the language of the religious believer, and the creed is summed up for us by Socrates himself when he says, "No soul which has not practiced philosophy and is not absolutely pure when it leaves the body may attain to the divine nature. That is for the lover of wisdom." And we'll find that Socrates gives mysteries due attention in many of his dialogues, and they take on a special emphasis just before Socrates experiences his own mystery rite of death. As he says here, it is likely that those who established the mystic rites for us were not inferior persons, but were speaking in riddles long ago, when they said that whoever arrives in the underworld uninitiated and unsanctified will wallow in the mire, whereas he who arrives there purified and initiated will dwell with the gods. And here, scholars have identified this or tried to identify it as saying that he is referencing Orphic rituals here, but it's worth comparing his concept with the afterlife with the one that's presented in Odyssey 11. Because in Odyssey 11, where we have the catabasis scene, we'll see Odysseus finding his mother. He questions her on her own death. Let's see if this will work. Yes, he questions her on her own death and also on the nature of the shades in the underworld. So this is what his mother replies to him when he asks why he can't embrace her. Is Persephone deceiving him with just a shade of her because he can't hug her in the underworld? And she says, no, Persephone isn't deceiving you. It is a law that touches all mortal beings when they die. No longer do they have sinews that bind flesh and bone together. For as soon as the spirit departs from their white bones, the fierce heat of the blazing fire destroys everything, and their shade flies off, fluttering like a dream. Hurry now and make for the light as quickly as you can, and remember all this so that someday you'll be able to tell your wife. So his mother gives him sort of not only a poignant portrait of what happens to the soul after death, but also a call to remember and repeat, which is sort of the thing that we get in Plato's dialogue, as well as Phaedo is recollecting these things and repeating them for all of our benefit. Now, I have highlighted the words thumos and psyche because we'll talk about them in just a few minutes when we compare it with something that Socrates said. So Odysseus's journey, as we've seen, his descent, his catabasis, mirrors many cult rituals in which truth about the afterlife is gained through a secret and sometimes subterranean experience, such as we might see with the Eleusinian mysteries. Thus, both Homer's Odysseus and Plato's Socrates frame the afterlife in terms of mysteries or mystery cults. So, but more interesting right now for the point of our discussion is the separation of the spirit and the shade, as I'm looking at this translation here, the thumos and the psyche. And this could be compared in some ways to Socrates' portrayal of body and soul. So here is where Socrates in the Phaedo is describing what happens after death. And he says, is it nothing else but the separation of the soul from the body? And this is what death is: separated from the soul, the body alone by itself, and the soul separated away from the body gets to be alone by itself. Death can't be anything other than this, can it? Now, here the Loeb edition notes that Socrates' concept of the soul and body as separate entities first appears in Homer and early Greek thought generally. That this passage of the Odyssey, while displaying the image of the shade slipping away from the consumed body on the pyre, uses two words for the soul, shade, or spirit, as we just saw, the thumos and the psyche. And though they are synonyms, psyche carries the connotation of the literal breath of life, and that is the word that Socrates favors in this dialogue. But Socrates also looks for a division within the Homeric soul in Odyssey, Book 20, as we'll see here. He quotes, as Homer wrote somewhere in the Odyssey, where he says that Odysseus struck his breast and rebuked his heart, saying, "Endure, my heart, you have endured worse than this." Do you think that when he composed this, the poet thought that his soul was a harmony, a thing to be directed by the affections of the body? Did he not rather regard it as ruling over them and mastering them, itself a much more divine thing than harmony? So part of Socrates' arguments, which we're not going into at length here because we're rather framing Socrates in terms of the Homeric epics and how he is portraying himself here. But part of his arguments deal with is there's a theory of opposites. Is the soul something that is attuned to like sleeping and waking? Is that what life and death is like? Or is it harmonized into one whole? Or is it something that can be divided? And these are questions that he sort of draws out over the course of the dialogue. And that's what he's referencing here, is Odysseus beating his breast and saying, calm down my passion, let me be strong and go through this. Now, this passage here from the Odyssey within the book structure, it occurs shortly before the festival of Apollo in Book 21. Here we are in Book 20. And thus it may have direct correspondence to Socrates' situation, because Socrates' death is specifically mentioned as occurring only when the poison reaches the heart, proste cardiae. And Socrates recounts Odysseus's use of gradie for heart which he interprets as the passionate part of man's soul, something which could possibly correspond to the thumos, or the seat of consciousness. It might be one interpretation of looking at it. In an argument that the soul is not one, or rather not always in harmony with itself, but instead divisible into parts. Still, scholars have been troubled by apparent disparity of the representations of the soul in the Phaedo. Is it bipartite, like the unity of opposites that Heraclitus proposes? Or is it a single entity, a remnant of Parmenidean monism? The answer cannot be defined within this dialogue, because the limits of the Phaedo are more dramatic than philosophic. The Phaedo is a poignant portrait of Socrates' last day. It is his final hymn and a record of many of his favorite doctrines, but not an exhaustive treatment of them. So Socrates himself, as if he is acknowledging the fact that not all questions are answered, bequeaths his role of philosopher to his interlocutors. The soul itself, for Socrates, within the Phaedo, is the Homeric psyche, or the breath of life. Like Achilles, he knows that a man's spirit, or his psyche, cannot come back when once it has passed the barrier of his teeth, as the Iliad reminds us. And as Socrates' body grows colder, Crito asks him, is there anything else that he would have done? But there was no answer. Socrates leaves the world without answering Crito's final question, albeit a trivial one. So the psyche, in his last logos as well, having left Socrates' body, it falls to Crito to close both his eyes and mouth. No more answers can come from Socrates, but his questions, in the spirit of the dialogue in which they are retained, continue to be asked, pondered, and debated. His final words are a boon, to give a cock in sacrifice to Asclepius, a healing god, and also to not forget. Set up as another Achilles and another Odysseus, he appears to have exceeded them, as the dialogue concludes with the words, such was the end of our comrade, Echecrates, a man who, we would say, was of all those we have known, the best, and also the wisest, and most upright. His song is still sung by his followers. Thus, like Achilles, he achieved his kleos in death, and framed within the festival to Apollo, it would appear that, like Odysseus, Socrates achieved his nostos in immortality and song. All right, now I'm going to stop this share, and let's see, did I